Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Sinister by Cassandra Clare. Again, I keep on forgetting to say the names of the authors. So this chapter is not necessarily a heavily edited chapter, but I did move some stuff around. Nothing crazy or anything like that, but I just wanted everyone to be aware that there's a little bit of juggling in this particular chapter. So, without any further ado, let's just get into it. Chapter 11. The Sleep of Reason. It was so cloyingly wet in the corridors under the burrow that Ginny felt as if every breath she took filled her lungs with water. She could hear the others behind her, splashing through the puddles that became increasingly deep. They were talking, but she didn't join in as she was concentrating on following the very slight, very insistent tugging sensation in the center of her chest. Charlie was holding his wand high above their heads to light the path in front of them, and asking Hermione a series of questions, which she answered readily. "So, what exactly happened to Helga Hufflepuff?" he asked. "Slytherin killed her," said Hermione, who had given up trying to stay dry and was splashing through the puddles as if she enjoyed it. "He killed Godric too, and Rowena, but that wasn't on purpose. Not that it makes it all right," she added hastily. "I'm just saying." "He seems to have regarded homicide as a hobby," said Ron, still keeping a watchful eye out for spiders. "Well, when you can flatten an entire city is at a whim, a tendency towards quiet reflection and seeing things from the other fellow's point of view is seldom necessary," put in Charlie. "That's true," Hermione agreed. Ginny suddenly paused, and the rest of them paused with her. They were at a place where the corridor split off into a triple-branched fork. Left, right, and straight ahead. "What's up, Gin?" Ron demanded. "I can't quite feel which way to go," she said, a little anxiously. The tugging feeling seemed to have gone for the moment, and she suddenly felt cold and rather damp. "Well, let's just go straight ahead then," announced Ron, walking past her. Ginny hesitated for a moment and was about to follow after him when, having taken no more than 20 steps down the corridor, Ron suddenly vanished. Hermione's stomach dropped down into her shoes. "Ron!" she shouted, running forward and nearly elbowing Ginny aside. She could hear Charlie right behind her as they approached the spot where Ron had disappeared. "Ron, where are you?" A very irritable voice spoke out of the darkness. "Down here." Beside her, Charlie raised his wand, flooded the corridor with light. The uneven walls were suddenly thrown into sharp relief, and the muddy floor that stretched in front of them and ended, rather suddenly, in a gaping, jagged-edged hole. Hermione peered over the edge of the hole, and Ron's pale face looked up at her, annoyed, but otherwise he seemed completely unharmed. She sagged in relief. "Ron, are you all right?" An expression of distaste crossed his face. "Mud," he said succinctly. "And it's dark. Could somebody toss me down a wand? I think I dropped mine and I'd like to find it." Hermione tossed her wand down to Ron, who caught it. "Lumos," he said. Bright light burst from the wand, illuminating the space around Ron. Hermione watched as his expression changed, and instead of the disgruntled look of someone who had fallen off his broomstick in the middle of an important game, Ron now looked like someone who had fallen off his broomstick in the middle of an important game, only to land in a hot tub full of Velas. "You've got to come down here," he exclaimed, but before anyone could move to do anything, though, Charlie had leapt down beside Ron, landing on his feet as lightly as a cat. Then he turned around and held his arms up to Hermione. "Your turn. I'll catch you." Taking a deep breath, she jumped. Charlie caught her easily and lowered her gently to the ground. She smiled a bit stiffly, then glanced around, and suddenly the expression on Ron's face made sense. It looked as if they were in some sort of underground vault. The floor was covered in mud, but the stone shelves that ranged along the walls were piled full of valuable-looking objects. Jewels, gold coins, bolts of tapestry, silver plates, cups and bowls. To be sure, much of it was ruined with age, but the majority was surprisingly intact. Hermione looked over at Ron, who was still staring around in shock. She could read the look on his face as clearly as if she were reading a book. All this was down here all these years, and we never knew. A sudden burst of sympathy for him propelled her to his side. "Ron," but he was examining something in his hand. "Look at this." He held out a gold coin to her. She took it without much interest, then stared. The face stamped on the coin was familiar. "It's Harry," she said blankly. "It's got a Gryffindor," said Ron. "It's a Gryffindor galleon, really old. They're worth loads." He looked at it a bit wistfully. "I wish we could show it to Harry. He'd think it was hilarious, him on a coin." "He'll get to see it," said Hermione firmly, and slipped it into Ron's breast pocket, patting it closed. A gleam at the corner of her eye caught her attention, and she turned and picked up a tiny round mirror edged with silver. It reminded her strongly of the mirror of Erised, with a very slight difference. "I don't think we should take anything from here," said Charlie from behind them. Hermione turned and looked at him. He was wearing an expression of mingled amazement and wariness. Pushing a stray lock of dark red hair back from his eyes, he sighed. "I know it's tempting, but you never know what kind of spells. Ginny, what are you doing?" Hermione and Ron both turned and saw Ginny. She was standing in a corner of the room, staring quite fixedly at the wall. Exchanging looks, Hermione and Ron hurried over to her. "Gin, what is it?" her brother asked. Ginny pointed. Up close, the wall was thick with dust, but one of the bricks stood out, clean and untarnished. It was pale silver, metallic, and etched across the side of it was a sentence in thin engraved letters. "To be gold is to be good. To be stone is to be nothing. To be glass is to be fragile. To be cold is to be cruel." Ron made a groaning sound. "Another riddle?" "It looks like it," said Charlie, ever the cautious voice of reason. "Anyone want to venture a guess?" Hermione, who knew the answer, decided not to speak. Instead, she looked at Ginny, who hesitated, then took a step forward and raised her hand. With her right index finger, she drew in the dust that covered the wall beneath the silver brick, the shape of a heart. Hermione thought she heard a faint chiming noise, as of distant music, and the brick slid out of the wall and toppled into Ginny's outstretched hands. Immediately, Charlie took it from her, bent on examining it. It turned out not to be a brick at all, but a sealed silver casket, rectangular in shape, and on top was engraved a manticore whose tail was curved into the shape of a sideways 8. Under its feet stretched a line of words in Latin. "What do those mean?" inquired Ron, staring suspiciously at the box. "It means this box belongs to time and the dark places," said Charlie. "What's that other word?" Hermione asked. "It looks a bit like the word for death, but it might not be." "Death?" said Ron. That sounds like a sort of translation one ought to be sure about before—" "Accio," interrupted Ginny firmly. The box soared out of Charlie's hands and landed in Ginny's grasp. She glanced up, saw them all staring at her in astonishment, and smiled serenely. "This is mine," she said with quiet conviction, and touched her hand to the side. The box emanated a single sharp musical note and opened like a flower, the lid sliding back. Bright light shone from its interior, illuminating Ginny's pale face as she reached into it and drew out something that dangled and shimmered on the end of a finely wrought gold chain. Something shaped like an hourglass, something ornately wrought and carved. "Oh," breathed Hermione, looking from the glittering pendant to Ginny's startled face. "It's a time turner." Bang! Snape heard the door shut behind him and felt savage satisfaction. As the door swung shut, he'd seen something change in Sirius's face. Shock moving into despair. He had been so sure that Snape would help him in whatever his sordid little problem was, because Sirius was one of those to whom everything came easily, without struggle or hardship. The sort of person who others fell all over themselves to help. The sort of person to whom the world had been given, no questions asked. But of course, that wasn't entirely true. Not really focusing on where he was going, Snape walked into his kitchen and stared blindly at the opposite wall. Azkaban. That had stopped Sirius laughing. Sometimes Snape dreamed about Sirius back in Azkaban, his laughter shattered forever into screams, and there was some pleasure in that, but also a gnawing sort of darkness. It was strange. Of all of them, he would have said he hated James the most for taking away the only person that had ever meant anything to him, Lily. Even thinking about her after all these years still stung. Knowing that she had chosen James over him was more than painful. It was heart-wrenching agony. And then James had saved his life, and that had been worse. He remembered James dragging him back from the Whomping Willow, throwing him on the ground, cursing Sirius under his breath, and Snape had thanked him. It wasn't like him to thank people, but he'd been shaken with fear and reaction. So he had thanked James, even though they weren't friends, and James had looked at him out of cool gray eyes and said, "I would have done the same thing for anyone." And he had hated James in that moment more than he had ever hated anyone in the world, or would ever hate anyone again. But James was dead. There was no point hating James anymore. There was only Sirius to hate. The dark mark on his left arm was burning, as it sometimes did when he was agitated, and his hands were shaking. He sat down at the kitchen table and switched on the radio. The sharp sounds of the WWN announcer filled the room.
Further news has come from the Ministry regarding the disappearance of Harry Potter, as well as Draco Malfoy, son of the late Lucius Malfoy of the prominent wizarding family. Both boys have now been missing for a day, and the Ministry urges anyone with information regarding either of the boys to come forward as soon as possible. In other news,
Snape got to his feet, switching the radio off as he did so, and almost before he knew what he was doing, he had turned and walked out of the kitchen, had raced down the corridor to the front door and thrown it open, letting in the cold night air. And there was Sirius, still standing in front of the door, head bowed, less like someone who was waiting than like someone who had nowhere else to go. His head whipped up as Snape opened the door, his eyes lighting with surprise and anger and hope. Snape clutched the knob of the door hard in his hand and snarled, "All right, Black. Tell me why you're here in 10 words exactly, or I'll activate the repulsus charm that's on this porch, and it'll hurl you halfway to Hogsmeade." Sirius looked as if he were counting to 10 and finding it insufficient. Because I need your help, he ground out through gritted teeth.
That's 5 words. Because I need your help, you completely infuriating, smug bastard, he snapped, losing his temper. You want me to beg? Is that what you want? I know you'd rather die than beg me for anything, said Snape. I would, Sirius agreed, but I'm not the one who's going to die.
There was a short silence. Then Snape stepped out onto the porch and crossed his arms over his chest.
Talk, he said.
In several short sentences, Sirius told Snape about all that had been going on as far as he knew. If I can help Remus, he said, then he can tell us more about Slytherin. He's being called to a location. He must know where it is. Don't look skeptical, I looked it up. It might be my only chance to get to Harry before it's too late. And I can tell by your expression that you don't believe me. Sirius's voice climbed several degrees in pitch. I'm telling you, Snape, if you send me away from here, I swear to you I will hunt you down and make sure that you spend the rest of your life sucking all your meals through a straw.
That won't be necessary,
said Snape. Sirius paused and blinked.
What? I was wrong about you once,
Snape said, taking a secret and surprisingly satisfying pleasure in the dumbfounded expression on Sirius's face.
I'm not wrong often.
He swung the door behind him wide.
I'm not planning on being wrong again.
Sirius looked from Snape to the door, then back again, as if he couldn't quite grasp what was happening. Then, with a sharp twitch of his shoulders, as if he were shaking off some dark shadow that clung to him, he walked over the threshold and into Snape's house. They were sitting in the living room of the Barrow, waiting for Charlie to come back from the kitchen, where he was having one of the Aurors hex test the Turner for malicious spells. Ginny was tapping her wand on the edge of the sofa impatiently as she waited. Hermione was finishing reading the book Ron had given her yesterday, and Ron himself was busy examining Fred and George's magazine collection, which they had brought up from its hiding place. Hermione shook her head at him. I cannot believe you are reading those. Ron grinned. These are quality publications. Ron, nothing you have to read sideways is a quality publication. Ignoring her jibe, Ron held up the magazine towards her and asked, Does this one look like Professor McGonagall to you, or am I going daft? Sighing, Hermione glanced at the indicated page without a great deal of interest, but after a quick inspection of the picture said, It does kind of look like her. Who knew she owned a kimono, or was so strangely fond of marmalade? Or was ever blonde, put in Ginny, leaning over. Ron hastily yanked the magazine away. Ginny, you're not allowed to look at that. Why not? Because you're a girl, and you're too young. Ron, I've got 6 older brothers. I'm thoroughly corrupted already. Hermione giggled. Ginny, don't say that. You'll give Ron an aneurysm. Ron grinned at her, but instead of making her want to grin back, though, she felt a wave of sadness. Just looking at him and even listening to the sound of his voice threw into painful relief the fact that Harry wasn't there. For so much of her life, it had always been both of them, Ron and Harry, flanking her constant companions. It was as impossible to separate them in her mind as it would be to separate Harry from his scar, or Draco from his acid sense of humor. Feeling as if she might burst into tears at any moment, she looked down at her book and stifled a sob. "What's up, Hermione?" Ron asked curiously. Nothing," she lied, and decided to change the subject. "Why do you think a manticore would be on the lid of Ginny's box?" "Probably means there's something bad in there," Ron reflected darkly. "That's not it," said Charlie, coming back into the kitchen holding the time turner. Clean bill of health, I'm told, he said, although he continued looking at it with suspicion. Ginny held out a hand. Let me have it, then. A bit reluctantly, Charlie did, and placed the tiny, sparkling hourglass in her palm. The light struck a sharp gold spark off the turner that lanced into Ginny's eyes. She shut them quickly, but not before the dark red after-images had begun to form a picture against the back of her eyelids. She saw a huge field where men and beasts strove together, and smoke rising above it, and, "Ginny," came Charlie's voice, and Ginny realized that she hadn't heard anything he had said. She opened her eyes with a start and raised them to smile at her brother. "I'm sorry, Charlie," she amended. "What were you saying?" "I was saying that you're not to use that thing until I've talked to Mum and Dad," said her brother, eyeing her with suspicion. "But you said there weren't any hexes on it." "I know," said Charlie, looking apologetic but firm. "But I'd like them to be here with us regardless. Now I want everyone to go to bed, and we can discuss this in the morning." "Right," said Ginny, and slipped the time turner into her pocket. Seeming satisfied with her answer, Charlie nodded, then turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. There was a short silence. Ron looked at Hermione, his mouth drawn down thoughtfully. "Do you really think the turner might be dangerous?" Hermione, who was anxiously fingering the lycanthia around her neck and looking thoughtful, said, "Not sure." Then she passed the back of her hand across her forehead and added abruptly, "I'm tired. I'm going to go lie down." She could feel the anxious gazes of the two siblings on her as she left the room, but didn't turn around. Sirius stood in Snape's workroom, watching the fires burn along the table, which was crowded with fat-bellied cauldrons. Thick smoke twined up towards the high ceiling, smelling strangely of mint and cabbage. The heat was beginning to make Sirius sweat through his clothes. Snape, by contrast, was looking almost cold, hunched into his robes and grumbling over a cauldron. "Adjustments will have to be made," he muttered. "Adjustments?" Snape glanced up and nodded. "The potion I'm brewing is meant to be administered to human beings. One of the key ingredients is wolfsbane, but some replacement will have to be found in this case, as I doubt it would agree with Lupin." "Quite," said Sirius, feeling lost. Potions had never been one of his favorite subjects. He much preferred transfiguration, at which he had excelled. He thought fondly back to one spring afternoon, when he had turned Snape's cauldron into a fat orange hamster which had bitten him on the toe. No, he told himself, mustn't think about that. Instead, he began prowling up and down the room, trying to look preoccupied. It wasn't hard. There were diversions enough in Snape's workroom to preoccupy anyone. Cauldrons of all sizes, jars of dragon's blood too hot to touch, flasks of weeping willow tears, caskets of mandrake, silver jars of powdered unicorn horn. Absently, Sirius paused to examine the books stacked haphazardly on the table. One in particular caught his eye, a heavy burgundy volume with a gold-stamped spine that read, "Demons, Demons, Demons." He picked it up and flicked it open. "Everything you wanted to know about Hell's denizens, and several things you didn't," read the flyleaf. "What are you looking at, Black?" demanded Snape. Sirius brandished the book in the air. "Demons, Demons, Demons. What a title. It's a book about demons. What would you call it?" "The Book of Demons?" Sirius suggested, flicking idly through the pages. "A name rife with single entendre." "It was just a suggestion," Sirius said, and broke off, staring down at a page of the book, his eyes wide. "Hey, can I borrow this book?" "You want to borrow my book?" Is there an echo in here? Sirius said, then shut his mouth hurriedly. Something about Snape always reduced him to the approximate age of 13. He just couldn't be in the same room with a man without having fantasies about hanging him upside down by the ankles over the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall with the words, "Kiss me, I'm Irish," magically emblazoned on his shorts. Not that Sirius had ever done such a thing. Certainly not. I mean, yes, I'd like to borrow it. Snape slammed the beaker he was holding down onto the table with force. Having a problem with demons? You might say that. Typical, said Snape shortly, without raising his head. Take the book if you want it. Thanks, said Sirius, realizing that this was the first time in his life he had ever thanked Snape for anything. It seemed momentous, but Snape apparently hadn't even noticed. He was leaning back, his gaze fixed on the smoking cauldron before him, a look of satisfaction on his face. It's done, he announced. Tucking the Book of Demons under his arm, Sirius strode over to the cauldron. The liquid in it had stopped bubbling and had settled down into a thick, smooth, silvery gray material, somewhat reflective, like mercury or moonlight. It was almost pretty. Sirius reached out a hand. Don't touch it, said Snape harshly. Sirius took his hand back, nettled. Well, pardon me for living. Snape looked up at him from under beetling dark brows, his black eyes flat, but said nothing, although Sirius privately suspected he wanted to. He reached for a copper-bound flask and began to fill it with the pale gray liquid from the cauldron. When he was finished, he held it out to Sirius, who reached to take it. As he did, the firelight struck a spark off the red stone in his bracelet. Vivicus charm? Asked Snape, eyebrows high. Harry, said Sirius shortly, taking the flask and stashing it in the inside pocket of his robes. It's a good thing you have that, said Snape shortly. Good for me, Sirius wondered, or good for Harry? He looked at Snape, and when Snape looked back at him, Sirius realized that they were done. It made him feel slightly lost. Look, he began haltingly, do you want to come with me? Snape blinked at him. What? I thought that you might like to see the effects of your potion, said Sirius, wondering if he might be going mad. To know that it worked. That's all. I made it. It will work, said the potions master coolly. Sirius blinked. Oh. Well, in that case, I should think— Don't thank me, interrupted Snape. The image of you trying to force that potion down the throat of a half-crazed werewolf is really all the thanks I need. Sirius looked down at the potion and back at Snape, who wasn't exactly smiling, but had a smug sort of look around his eyes. This potion isn't going to make Lupin sprout bat ears or boils or any other side effects like— Oh, bugger off, Black, interrupted Snape in exasperation, and Sirius, realizing that he was fighting a losing battle, disapparated, flask and book in hand. Hermione glanced up and down the corridor outside Bill's bedroom. The hallway was empty. Cautiously, she reached into the pocket of the loose robes she had thrown on over her pajamas and drew out the lycanthy. Immediately, a sharp prickling shot up her arm and shoulder. She had felt the same prickling coming from the lycanthy earlier that day, whenever she had been near the time turner. At least, that was what it seemed like, what Hermione was banking on, too. She raised her hand, the lycanthy in it, and it quivered, almost with excitement. Hermione began following after its tugging, which became more and more pronounced as she neared Ginny's room. Trying to be as quiet as possible, she reached out for the doorknob, when a hand shot out of the darkness and grabbed her. She nearly swore out loud and looked up to see Ron standing in front of Ginny's door holding her wrist. He looked angry, his blue eyes blazing and his red hair sticking up around his head in bright red flames. "Hermione, what do you think you're doing?" he hissed. "Uh-oh," she thought, biting her lip hard. "Did I wake you up?" she whispered back, her voice more than a little wobbly. "Hermione, what are you playing at?" Ron hissed, dropping her wrist so hard it almost hurt. "I was just trying to sneak into Ginny's room to get that time turner. Going to see if you could figure out how to use it on your own, never mind how dangerous it might be. Ron, I could just tell from your expression when you left the kitchen tonight that there was something on your mind, but far be it for you to tell me the truth. Stop scolding me. Then tell me why you're bloody acting like this." Hermione had told herself she wasn't going to cry, but it was no use. She squeezed her eyes shut, and angry tears scorched her cheeks. "It's got nothing to do with you, Ron," she said. Ron went even paler in the light of the lycanthropy. "Tell me what you're planning on doing once you use that time turner," he spat, "or I swear I'll go wake Charlie right now and you can explain everything to him." "How?" "Yes, I'll do it." "If you two are going to argue," said a new voice in an equally venomous whisper, "then could you bloody do it somewhere else other than outside my bedroom?" The two in question turned and saw an irritable-looking Ginny standing in the door of her room. "Oh, good, you're awake," said Ron, still sounding angry. "Mind if we come in? After all, Hermione was about to come in anyway." And he pushed past Ginny and into her room without looking back at the other girl. Ginny was momentarily stunned before she moved aside to let Hermione in, who crossed the threshold of the room with her eyes on the floor. Once inside, Ginny closed the door and muttered a muffliato charm to keep their conversation private, then turned to look at Ron and Hermione. The former was staring out the window looking mutinous, but Hermione went over to sit on Ginny's bed and didn't move. "What was Ron saying early about you trying to get in here?" Ginny asked Hermione. "I wanted to get the time turner," Hermione replied in a small voice. There was a beat while Ginny processed what she had just said. "You mean you were going to take it from my room without permission?" Hermione nodded. "Yes." Now Ginny understood why Ron looked so upset, and didn't much blame him. "Why would you do something so reckless, Hermione, and without consulting either of us?" She didn't look up, but Hermione could taste her own tears in her mouth as she answered the only way she knew how, with cold facts. "I will do whatever it takes to help Harry," she said quietly. "The Founders knew Slytherin was going to come back, and they knew that when he did, that heirs were going to try to figure out how to defeat him. Draco said that Rowena told him that we needed to find the creature that has the orb locked inside it. Maybe that's what the keys are for. Maybe that's why they left that turner locked in a place where only an heir could find it. I think if I use the lycanthropy, it'll portkey me to Slytherin's castle. With any luck, it'll be deserted in the past, and it will get me Harry back." Ginny blinked, clearly confused. "That doesn't make any sense. How is this time turner going to send us that far back? It sounds a bit far-fetched, Hermione." The other girl gripped the lycanthropy in her hands and pressed on. "There are two ways you can use a time turner," she said mechanically. "You can turn it over and over until you go as far back as you want to, or you can set it to a specific time. That one is set." Ron finally glanced over at her. He was still annoyed, but his curiosity was piqued. "Set," he repeated. "Set to what?" Hermione shrugged. "I don't know, but I am going to find out." Ginny shook her head. "No, not you. Us. You think we're going to let you go by yourself? How thick are you?"
"Very thick,"
said Ron fervently. Hermione finally raised her head and glared at Ron. "I am not thick. I don't want either of you to come with me." Ginny made a noise, somewhere between exasperation and disbelief, while Ron merely set his jaw in a stubborn line.
"Why not?"
he demanded. Hermione took a shuddering breath. "Professor McGonagall told me, 3rd year, you never to go back in time by more than a few days. That the further you go back, the harder it is for you to return." She pointed at the Turner, where it sat on Ginny's bedside table with a shaking hand. "That Turner belonged to the Founders. I saw them making it in my dream. I think it's set to 1,000 years ago. That's what I believe." "Hermione," said Ginny patiently, "this Time Turner belongs to me. I knew that the moment I touched it. Do you honestly think it'll work without me along to guide it?" "I hadn't thought of that," Hermione admitted.
"No, you didn't,"
Ron replied waspishly.
"You think you're the only one who's worried about Harry. You think you own all that pain, and that gives you the right to try to fix us all by yourself. Everything we've ever faced, we've faced together, and you're going to change that now just because you and Harry are dating?"
He hurled himself around as if he were going to storm out of the room. "It's not that," Hermione protested quickly. "It's this." And she pulled the lycanthropy out of her pocket. "This gives me powers, Ron. Majid-level powers."
"Oh, so now this is because we're not Majids?" he snapped. "If either Ginny or myself were Malfoy, you wouldn't leave us behind."
"Ron, you're nothing like Draco," Hermione replied without thinking.
"And I bet you wish I was," he said with corrosive bitterness.
"Stop it!" Ginny practically shouted, putting herself between the two, who stared at her in shock. "Ron, I understand that you are hurting about this in ways we can't possibly understand, but now isn't the time to air those grievances. Hermione, Ron is right. You're being awfully selfish about Harry and trying to steal my Time Turner and going off on your own proofs it. We are coming with you whether you like it or not. Now, you two have until the time I change to make up before we all go." And she stomped to her dresser and began to grab clothes out without saying another word. There was a short silence. "You're my best friend, Ron," Hermione said quietly. Ron stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. Finally, he looked up at her. "Am I?" "You know you are," she said, "and I'm yours. Aren't I?" "You are," he said, then seemed to throw caution to the wind as he told her all he had been feeling. "I keep thinking I should have, done something to save Harry. I should have realized that Charlie wasn't Charlie either. Apparently I don't know my own brother." "It wasn't your fault," she said kindly. "It's just," said Ron, a little hesitantly. He had the wary expression of someone about to yank off a bandage and anticipating the pain. "I don't know how to feel with Malfoy in the picture. Just jealous, I suppose." Hermione stood up and went to stand closer to him. She tried to take him by the shoulders, but he was too tall, so she ended up gripping his upper arms. "Ron," she said slowly, "nobody can ever replace you. Not for me, not for Harry. You are the first friend Harry ever had. He wouldn't even know what it was like to have a friend if it weren't for you. He wouldn't be who he is. I wouldn't either, without you." Ron looked down at her. "But you didn't want me to come with you," he said. "Only because I didn't want anything to happen to you. Either of you," she said truthfully, hoping he believed her. "I just feel so helpless, like I've got no control over anything, Like we're all pawns in some huge game I don't even understand. And worst of all is I've got no idea what's really going on, and I feel like we're all hurtling towards some sort of horrible disaster without any way of stopping it. She raised her head and looked at him, and saw his expression with surprise. Why are you smiling? I was just thinking about chess, he said. Did you know that if the pawn can get all the way across the board, it becomes the most powerful player in the game? Hermione sniffled and took his hand. You know I'm terrible at chess. I was wrong. I do want you to come with me. Both of you. His shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. All right, he said, and pulled away from her. Just let me go get something from my room real quick. And he left before either girl could ask him why. By the time he returned, Ginny was dressed in jeans and a pullover jumper, and Hermione was back to sitting on the bed, looking at him expectantly. What did you go get? Ginny asked curiously, as he sat down beside Hermione on the bed. Nothing, said Ron, waving his hand airily. Just something I thought we might need. You know, he added, it occurs to me that Charlie is going to be furious when he wakes up and finds us gone. Hermione smiled slightly as she pulled the lycanthropy out of her pocket once more. If it works properly, he'll never know we were gone at all. We'll be back when we left. And if it doesn't work properly? Ginny asked. Then we'll have a way bigger problems than Charlie, like being stuck in the past forever. It might not be so bad, said Ron. We can invent the wheel and get rich. Ron, it's 1,000 years ago, not 1,000,000. They had the wheel. I knew that. As far as you're concerned, history is just something that happens to other people, isn't it? This from the girl who's still bitter that there are only 7 years of school. Quit bickering, said Ginny firmly, and they sobered almost immediately. Distantly, Hermione could feel the lycanthropy in her hand, and that strange buzzing she had heard the first time she had used it was suddenly back. Ginny took the time turner from her bedside table and sat on the bed next to the others, looping the chain around all of them as she did so. Knowledge flooded her brain like a burning light in the back of her mind. Everyone hold on to me, she announced. Now. She pulled Ron and Hermione towards her, linking arms with them. And the world around them spun away into darkness. The first thing he noticed was how quiet it was. He had been so long in darkness that the silence came as a greater shock than an explosion would have been. The last human thing he remembered was having been in the dungeon, in the cell with Sirius, telling him he should get out while there was time. Lupin's eyes flew open. He was lying on his back on a stone bench, staring up at a dank stone ceiling. The dungeon. Everything hurt, as if he had been pelted with stones. But he was whole. He turned his head to the side, slowly, trying to ignore the pain in his neck, and saw Sirius. He was sitting on the ground next to the bench, his back against the stone wall, legs outstretched. He looked exhausted, even more than he did the night he'd flown his motorcycle across the Atlantic to get to King's Cross by the time the Hogwarts Express left. Moony, he said. Lupin rolled over to his side, wincing at the pains that drove through his cramped muscles. Badfoot, he tried to say, and heard his own voice come out hoarse and nearly unrecognizable, as if it had been terribly strained. He cleared his throat. That hurt too, but it didn't matter. Sitting up, he looked down at himself and saw that he was wearing the clothes he had been wearing yesterday? How long had he been a wolf? Padfoot, he said again, louder this time. What happened? But Sirius was on his feet, holding out a hand to Lupin, who took it and helped him up. Then Sirius was embracing him, as he had embraced him that day 3 years ago, back in the Shrieking Shack, like a brother. "You're all right," said Sirius, pounding his friend on the back. "You're all right." Lupin pulled back, wincing a little. "I am. I hurt all over, as if I got steamrolled by a hippogriff, but I'm fine. Sirius, how long was I?" "2 days," said Sirius, and his black eyes darkened further. "Around 2 days." Lupin's hands tightened hard. "Did I hurt anyone?" "No," said Sirius, looking somber. How did you bring me back?" Sirius hesitated, then reached over and picked up a small clear flask banded with copper. "I didn't. Snape did. He gave me a will-strengthening potion for you." Lupin stared. "Really?" "Uh-huh." "And what did you have to do for him? He wouldn't just have done that for you for no reason." "Well, I had to agree to run naked through the halls of Hogwarts yelling, 'Severus Snape rules!' at the top of my lungs." "Well, it's a tragedy school isn't in session then, is it? There will be no one to admire your nude form." "Good point," said Sirius, grinning. Lupin looked down again at the flask in Sirius's hands and blinked, noticing for the first time that he was wearing heavy leather gloves that reached halfway up his forearms. They looked like dragonhide. His left sleeve was ripped through. "I did that," he thought, his heart sinking. "Padfoot, did I bite you?" Sirius shook his head. "No. Which begs an interesting question. If you did, would I be a super werewolf, since dogs are basically just domesticated wolves?" Lupin sat down on the bench, more out of exhaustion than anything else, and grinned. "Shut up, Padfoot." Sirius smiled back, but it faded as quickly as it had come. He cleared his throat. "I have to ask you, do you remember anything?" Lupin shut his eyes. Lightning danced across his field of vision and pressed against the backs of his lids. Black night, silver moonlight, forest paths, a castle rearing up out of the darkness, black against a white sky. At night, the battlements were the color of liquid mercury. Guards stood ranged along them in robes of black and silver, and a voice at the base of his skull.
"Come here now."
He saw a familiar face, turned towards him, pale hair and eyes, sensed betrayal, darkness. His eyes flew open. "I do remember," he said, raising his eyes to Sirius. "I remember everything. The call, everything." Sirius leaned forward. "I'd better tell you what's been going on." And that is all for this chapter, guys. Quotes. "The Sleep of Reason" is from Hamlet, by Shakespeare, obviously. And "when you can flatten entire cities at a whim, a tendency toward quiet reflection and seeing things from the other fellow's point of view is seldom necessary" is from Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. Demons, 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 what a title. It's a book about demons, what would you call it, is from Angel. So as always, if you are enjoying this kind of content, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you are interested in supporting me monetarily, I have a Ko-fi and a Patreon, both linked in the About section here on YouTube. And for those of you that are interested, for the 25 days of Christmas, that is December 25th through January 5th, I will be releasing my own fan fiction writings in the Harry Potter universe that I did with my best friend way back in the day. Those will be at the $2 mark there, and they will only be up for the days that I have listed, so December 25th through January 5th. at the $2 mark, as I will not be releasing them here on YouTube. So if you guys want to check that out, that would be super cool. And if you see other stuff at the $2 mark, because that will unlock other things that I have on my Patreon, feel free to stick around if you like what you see. And that is all, guys. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.